and today I'm going to continue my series in the Queen's Gambit. So we last left off when we were sort of looking at this Moran variation with d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e3. And I think it's quite an interesting position. We're looking at knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d6, and the last thing we looked at was g4, which is one of my personal favorites. But here we're going to look at bishop d3, which is being played a lot these days. So one might say we just looked at bishop d3 last time, but in this exact same position, except with the white queen on d1 and the bishop on d6. And one could definitely make a case that it's much more useful for black to play bishop d6 than it is for white to play queen c2. But in some ways, I kind of disagree, because the point is after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, here white has the added option of putting the bishop on e2. And I think it's kind of a strange concept, but e2 is a better square than d3. And the main reason is because black's pawn structure here, especially at this pawn on c6, is extremely vulnerable. And he's almost certainly going to want to break with either c5 or e5 at some point. And white's thinking, pretty soon, let's say moves like castles, bishop b7 take place, white's going to play rook d1, which will heavily discourage black from playing e5 or c5, or at least make it much more difficult. So, going back, the reason one wouldn't play bishop d3 first is because after dc4, bishop c4, okay, b5, of course, and we looked at this bishop d3, but a6, e4, c5, but if bishop e2 here, after b4, white's knight on c3 is kind of kicked into oblivion. It's kicked onto like a4 or some stupid square like that. But if white plays queen c2 first, bishop d6, bishop d3, if dc4 now, bishop c4, b5. After bishop e2, b4, white has the e4 square, where the knight will be much better placed, and white certainly doesn't mind an exchange of knights. For one thing, I'm not sure, but it might be possible to play queen takes c6 here, which would win a pawn. And if it isn't after queen takes c4, white certainly seems okay. Let's say black protects his pawn. Castle, if black ever plays knight f6, there's queen h4 is a nice square. And again, black's structure is a little bit compromised and he's a little bit underdeveloped. So black usually is a little more patient. He usually castles here. And now white castles back. So there's two main moves here for black, d takes c4 and e5. So e5 is a little bit simpler. Black has to be willing to accept an isolated pawn position after something like take, knight b5, bishop b8, d5, knight e5, bishop e2, and okay, white certainly will get some play against the isolated pawn, but black doesn't seem to have too many problems. I think draw is the most likely result, but of course both sides can play for a win. But the main problem with bishop d6 is if in this position after cd5, white has this option of playing e4, which is often considered to be pretty reasonable. So there's a couple lines here. E takes d4 after knight takes d5, I think white definitely has some pull. There's some line that goes knight d5, e d5, and pawn on d4 is a little bit exposed. Seems pretty strong for white, I would think. I know there's some crazy variation where black sidelines his pieces or something, and puts his like queen on h5 somehow. I'm not quite sure how that goes, but I think white's doing quite well in that position. So really the main move here is d takes e4. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. Black couldn't really keep up the tension, so he has to resolve it. And now here h6. And okay, if black gets a couple moves and plays e takes d4, knight f6, he should equalize pretty comfortably. I don't think white would ever really have any kind of advantage. So there have been a few tries here, though. The one thing that will deter black players from playing this line is just like the huge probability that the game will be a draw. He'll almost never win. So there's a few tries for white. I think main one is bishop e3, but I could be wrong. So now e takes d4. Bishop takes d4 has been played. I think there's a game of Kobian white against Robson where Kobian played like bishop d4, knight f6, rook e1, and black played queen c7, which is probably a mistake, and after queen c7, bishop c7, bishop f6, gf6, bishop d5, which is a strong move. The white rook was getting ready to come into e7, and white certainly had some advantage and ended up winning a very nice game. So, but black does have improvements. You can probably take the bishop on e4 here, for example, although it still remains unclear. For a while, the main move was bishop d4, knight f6, bishop f5, but I think after queen a5, black doesn't have so much to worry about. It hits the bishop on f5, and if bishop c8, say rook f c8, it's black seems to be reasonably enough developed. So people were starting to play this intermediate move, bishop h7 check, with the idea after king h8, bishop d4, knight f6, bishop f5, we have the same position except the black king's on h8. Now, normally you might think this just shouldn't make a difference, for example, queen a5. But the point is now after bishop c8, rook c8, queen b3, queen d5, this will be the normal variation. Bishop f6, queen b3, a b3, gf6. Normally you'd have this position and, okay, both sides have some crippled pawns, but I don't think black has any reason to think he's worse. But the point is here, white has this extra option because he's put his king on the dark square of desperadoing the bishop on g7. Although even still, my feeling is after a move like rook c6, planning rook b6 to attack the crippled white pawns, black certainly should not stand any worse. Note that it would be a blunder to play, well, not necessarily a total blunder, but rook c2 would be a mistake because after knight d4, the pawn on b2 is not capturable because knight f5 check is threatened. So a much better move would be rook c5, but then it's pretty clear that rook c2 didn't quite work out the way black was hoping to. So that's a pretty simple variation, I think. But far and away the more complicated one, and the one black should play if he wants to try to play for a win, is dc4, bishop c4. So a lot of moves have been played in this position. I once played queen e7 here, which is considered dubious, and I think it's actually better than his reputation, but on the whole it's not the best move. I've analyzed this position quite deeply because I play it for both colors, and I think it's very interesting. One of the main ideas is to play b5, and now there's a line that goes bishop d3, bishop b7, a3. White is thinking he wants to play b4. That way he stops black's play with c5. He's also prevented b4. Black plays a6, and now b4. And now that white has played b4 and made a little hook to attack, black will often hit him with a5. Rook b1, take, queen e7, trying to put pressure on the pawn. So here white often goes on some sort of little escapade with e4, and the idea is to play e5. If bishop b4 after e5, the knight is hit when it moves, h7 hangs, and black is probably in some trouble. So black plays e5 here, and then knight e2. So if bishop b4 again after d5, it's not immediately clear what to do. Or sorry, if bishop b4, they play knight g3 first. g6, d5, and of course you can't take back because then the end b4 will hang, leaving white up a piece. But they usually play knight g4 here, and now e6 is a strong move, like breaking up black's kingside pawn structure. F takes e6. Of course, queen e6 is again impossible because of rook b4. So f takes e6, and now bishop g5. If queen c5, already queen b3 wins the pawn back on e6, although even still the position isn't clear. And basically the position we're getting to is a total mess, and 2,700 players are still debating what's going on in their games, and it leads to very interesting play. There was a recent game from my friend Vinay Bhatt. I suspect he may write an article on this game later on that you might want to check out, although I don't know if he's actually done it yet, where he played e takes d4 in this position. His idea being after knight f5, which was white's main threat, he has the c5 square for the queen, after which he's better. So white has to play e5. And now this looks very strong, because it gets rid of the black knight, and white will take on h7 and really mess up the black king side. He's going to recapture on d4. He's getting space in the center. But Vinay's idea was knight takes e5, knight e5, and c5. And suddenly he's got these three connected pass pawns on the queen side for the piece. And white has some stuff on prise. Although the guy playing white, strong Kazakh grandmaster, Mortez Kazgalayev, played a very strong move here, rook takes b4. shattering the black pawn structure, and after knight c6, it transpires that black is probably lost because he's very likely to lose all three of his queenside pawns, and then the 2 pieces against the rook should be enough to win. Like, the main point here is if queen d6, which looks like the right move because it traps the knight. And okay, if bishop b5, rook c8 doesn't seem to help much. There's actually a little tactical trick with knight to f5, and it seems that black's in a lot of trouble because queen c6 is met by knight to e7 check. So that's the line where white brings his bishop back to d3. There's also this line where white plays back to e2, which I think is also interesting. It's been played many times. So bishop b7, rook d1, queen c7. Of course, it's very important for black to move his queen. If he plays a move like a6, then white manages to play e4, because now white will play e5 and gain space in the center, and black does not have time to counter with e5 because his pin's on the d file. So if black plays a move like bishop c7 here after e5, his position is miserable. So main move is queen c7, although queen b8 is also played quite often, both with the same idea of meeting e4 with e5. And you get a very complex middle game. Usually, whoever releases the tension in the center first is going to end up worse. If black plays e takes d4, oftentimes he just lets white's pieces into play. If white plays d5, let's say he does it here after knight e5, immediately black's pieces are getting into play. And there's an imbalanced pawn structure, almost a little bit resemblant of the Benoni, although the piece placement is completely different. And there's good chances to play for a win for both sides. You have to be very tactically sharp and very patient to play these positions correctly. I'll show one game which I thought was really cool here. One little sub-variation, bishop g5, e4, rook d4. And now b4 was played. And this position came from the game Akobian playing white against Becerra in the US Championship 2009. And here, I think normally bishop f6 is played, and my feeling is actually white probably gets quite a playable game. For example, if bc3 after bishop g7, black seems to be losing because white gets his piece back and black's king remains open and he's still down a pawn. So knight f6 is the main move, but then there's knight a4, and white's idea is to put the knight on c5, thus preventing black from breaking with c5 and activating his bishop. And if black plays c5, there's a nice little tactic here, so I'll give you a second to try to find it. Alright, so the tactic is rook takes d6. The idea after queen d6, e5 picks up a piece back, and white should be winning with the 2 pieces for the rook. So, but in the game, white found something which was also very strong with rook a d1, which was extremely interesting. Of course, it would not be in black's favor to take on c3 after rook d6. White seems completely dominating with the bishop pair and a bigger central presence and a healthier pawn structure. So he plays bishop c5. Positionally speaking, white's in great shape, but it looks like he's facing some concrete problems because his rook on d4 is hanging as well as the knight on c3. But here Akobian unearthed a nice exchange sacrifice on d7. And after knight a4, white's position seems very promising because black bishop is a little bit short on squares. If he goes back to b6, which is what happened in the game, white plays bishop e7, if rook e8, bishop d6, something like this. After e5, moves like bishop c4 coming into play, and black's b7 bishop is very passive. It's extremely dangerous, to say the least, and black can probably expect to come under very ferocious attack. In the game, black sacrificed the exchange back with knight e5, but that didn't solve his problems. And the bishop doesn't really have any other squares. Of course, e7 is illegal, and if d6, then after queen d2, white's piling up on the d-file, and after knight c5, which looks like it comes in to save the day, white has a strong move e5, which seems to win the game. Because if knight takes a4, e takes d6, white's going to have a powerful pass pawn in the 7th rank that should decide matters. He's also very likely to win the d4 pawn. And if bishop e7, white simply takes and grabs b4 with the pin to the queen, and white will take a piece back and have a completely winning position. So that was a very interesting game, but since then improvements have been found for both sides. After rook takes d4, the move knight e5 is extremely interesting, for example. Allowing bishop f6, gf6, thinking that, okay, black gets good play against the white king side. For example, g3, bishop c5, followed by knight g4. and there's pretty reasonable play. And, of course, queen b8 is a move in this position as well, after which e4, e5 again is played, and it's also very interesting. But I think I'm going to leave it at that in terms of the Moran stuff, so I can go on to the last little part of the Slav in the Queen's Gambit. So I'm going to go back, and that's what happens if white plays e3 in this position. Oh, sorry, actually, I'm going to go to knight c3, dc4 first. So knight c3, dc4, and now this is a very interesting position. Okay, if white wants to take the pawn back, he probably has to play a4. A move like e3 won't help him much, because after b5, a4, he certainly gets his pawn back, but after b4, it's just, his knight's going to get kicked away. It's not really going to be so great. Knight a2, a5, something like this, takes e6. The white knight on a2 is just so passive, and black will have no issues playing c5 and eliminating his weak pawn. I think black should be totally fine. So the only real ambitious move is a4. You could also play e4 here, which is the, I guess, Slav gambit, as they call it. My feeling is after b5, black's in fine shape. So the main move is a4, bishop f5. For sake of simplicity and time, I'm not going to go into the other lines here. Knight e5 and e3 are the main moves. So, for example, knight e5, the idea is that he doesn't really want to take on c4 with the knight, but he wants to play f3 and then e4, gaining space in the center, and then take with the bishop. So the main move here is knight bd7, although e6 is also played with like f3, bishop b4, e4, takes, knight e4, some very long, sharp variation. Queen f3 here is a draw after queen d4, queen f7, king d8, and then bishop g5. It's important to play bishop g5. If you play queen g7 right away after bishop c3, bc3, queen f2, knight c3 is checkmate. So, but white plays bishop g5 check, and then knight takes g5, queen takes g7. White's not threatening, queen takes h8, knight f7, and then queen takes d4, queen takes g5, rook d1, a million threats, and black is completely forced to take a perpetual check, and something like this is just a perpetual. Note it would be stupid to take the rook after knight c6 or something, lose the queen, some trickery. So that's a forced draw, but white certainly has every reason to play on in this position after bishop d2, queen d4, knight e4, queen e4, queen e2, bishop d2, king d2, queen d5, king c2. Okay, black has 4 pawns for the piece at the moment, but he's almost certainly going to lose one of them right back on c4, and his pieces are undeveloped, and I think white certainly is a little bit better here. Obviously, there's excellent practical chances for black. He's got all these pawns, white's king's open, you know, even if the queen's trade, black's got reasonable play. But I think objectively speaking, white should be a bit better. So the main move as after knight e5 is to play knight d7 and then takes. And there's some stuff like knight b6, knight back to e5, a5 with AD after f3, knight back to d7, trying to challenge this knight. And this is sort of a passive setup, I think, after something like g3, white often just gets sort of, he just gets a more active position, something like this, h6, e4, sorry. There's like e4 in some cases, and bishop h7, and maybe queen e2 or something, and it seems pretty reasonable for white. Okay, queen e2 might hang the pawn, but there's other moves here. I think white often has simple e3 is possible as well, bishop g5, but nowadays the main move is queen c7, with the idea black wants to play e5 and castle, but then probably castle queenside and get to a really interesting position. Okay, so a move like f3 doesn't work now, because after e5, e4, e takes d4, black's just better. So e takes f5, dc3, black will put the bishop on c5, castle queenside, put the other rook on e8, all of his pieces are active, and white's king is stuck in the center. So the main move is to play g3. The idea of fianchettoing shadowing the king's bishop and putting the queen bishop on f4. Okay, black has to play e5, d e5, knight e5, bishop f4, knight d7. Note that it would be a blunder to play rook d8 instead of knight d7, because because now after queen c1, knight d7, there's bishop e5, knight e5, queen f4, which seems to win the game. So going back, the The best move is knight d7, bishop g2. And now two moves are played here, f6 and g5, with the latter being extremely aggressive and very sharp, and f6 being a little bit more passive. And I think in both cases, black's getting fine play. Let's say f6, castle short, castle long. Both sides are going to come under some serious pressure. Black on the queen side, white probably in the center, especially because his queen is lacking some good squares. And just a very interesting position. I think that requires a lot of study. It's being played a lot these days. I remember I saw a recent game, GM-elect Alex Lenderman played, which went rook c1, knight c5, queen e1. And now black sort of took the bait with knight b3, trying to advance. But now after knight b5, queen b8, queen c3, takes, white's completely winning. Because he's about to go completely nuts on black's king, start with some sacrifices, and Lenderman won the game very quickly. I also saw another recent game where a5 was played, and Ivanchuk Nakamura, and after knight c5, queen e1, knight b3, Ivanchuk had to accept the repetition as follows. And there's just a lot of interesting play in this position. It's double-edged, and both sides have their fair chances. So g5 is a little bit sharper. It's immediately putting question to the bishop. Tactically speaking, it's sound because bishop g5 loses to knight c4. If white takes the knight first, black takes the bishop. And if knight d7, a strong move here, castle's long. And after queen d4, actually a surprising move, queen takes d7, looks quite strong for black, I think. If the queens get traded, I don't think black has any issues at all. He'll play moves like bishop g7, and white can't castle because of rook d2, and black's extremely active with the bishop pair, and white's pawns are misplaced on the queen side. Black looks to have at least full compensation for the pawn, probably a better position. So normally queen takes f4 is played here, bishop d6, queen back to d4. Now, even some bishop c7, for example, looks quite acceptable. And again, if takes, I don't think black has much to worry about. Should also point out that if white takes the rook, then after queen d2, king f1, queen b2, white can't, of course, play rook d1, because after rook d1, knight d1, queen hangs on h8. So he plays something like rook e1, and after bishop b4, I would be extremely worried if I was playing white. It's looking like black's getting a piece back. And while white will still be up in exchange, you have to ask the question, is he really up the exchange? Because in my opinion, this rook on h1 is certainly no better than either of the black bishops. And white's king is definitely unsafe. So I think black definitely has good play here. And so the two main moves here are knight e3 and bishop takes e5. So if knight e3, the idea is after gf4, knight f5, we have a very interesting position where basically, okay, so let's say castle long, queen c2. Black completely dominates the dark squares, and white completely dominates the light squares. White will probably attack black's king on the king side, and black will attack the king on the queen's. Or sorry, white will attack black's king on the queen side, and black will attack white's king on the king side. Sorry, it's a tongue twister of sorts. And it's a very sharp position with a lot of interesting games played. I would definitely recommend it to anybody who really enjoys sort of opposite side attacking and rich, complex tactical and positional play. The other move, bishop takes e5, is a bit more forcing. After knight takes e5, queen d4, f6. There's some very long lines. Castle long, I think the main move here is bishop e7, but I found an idea I kind of like for black, which is rook d8. So queen e3 and now bishop e7. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5. Of course, going back, white had to put the queen on e3. There's no other square, otherwise he'd lose the knight on c4. Endgames are almost certainly going to be fine for black with his bishop pair and better queenside structure, so white can't really take d8. But queen e3, bishop e7, knight e5, queen e5. And now there's some very sharp play. Queen takes a7 looks very tempting, but it's kind of quite comically refuted by queen takes c3 with a little checkmate on a3, which would be kind of embarrassing for someone to fall into. So the main move is rook takes d8, king takes d8, and now the point is black king will try to run to the queen side. And if white takes the pawn now after bishop a3, white's a little bit better, there's no question, but I think black, the position should be a draw. For example, rook d1, king c8 is an important move. If queen a8, king c7, white's in trouble because the rook's attacking the queen and queen c3 is threatened. Knight b5 is the only move, and after queen d5, ab5, rook a8. I actually played this position once against Dan Fernandez, international master from Texas, and we agreed to draw here. So since he's a strong player, I was happy to draw with black. And but the main move is queen d4, and now after takes bishop c5. White has a little trick with rook d2. The idea is now if bishop f2, e4 wins. But here, I think with black's bishop pair and better queenside structure, he's worse because he's down a pawn, but he should be able to draw. For example, if h5, e3, h4, knight e4, we can probably take. And with the opposite color bishops, my feeling is this position objectively should be drawn. Although, okay, black will certainly have to do some work for it. But so that's sort of the knight e5 variation. Sorry to hit you with all this opening theory. I'm trying to show you how to play these positions as well. There's also this e3 line, which it's less ambitious. I think you're more likely to just take the pawn right away and not sort of waste time with your knights. But also the white center doesn't advance nearly as much, and his dark scored bishop isn't as active. So something like e6, bishop c4, bishop b4, castle, castle. There's knight h4 here, and there's queen e2. And black's goal is going to be to try to restrict white's play in the center, eventually break with c5 or e5. He's well developed and very solid. I don't think he has any reason to think he's worse. This was a very popular line in the Kramnik-Topalov match, and Kramnik held a few times with black very convincingly here. So I think this was very interesting and strong. So I would suggest anybody play this position because while it's very solid for black, it's also rich in positional ideas. And if things go well for him, then he's going to end up better. So I've won plenty of games from this position with black, even though there's no real plan for attack or anything just yet. So I'm going to go back to the position after knight f6, e3. So if e6, the position is very likely to transpose to a Moran after something like knight c3. There is this other option white has is playing b3, which is the recommended system in Volume 1 of Grandmaster Boris of Rook's series on how to play 1d4 with white for an advantage, which is a very good series, but I'm not so much of a believer in this particular variation. I think the other analysis he gives is great. I know I pre-ordered the second volume and have it now, so I'm not saying it was a bad book, but I do think that this variation is not the greatest. It says a healthy plan if black plays like in a normal Moran fashion and something like this. Knight bd2, castle, I'm just making some moves. Oftentimes he gets into some unpleasantness because white plays like knight e5 and f4, and he's sort of got a built-in kingside attack. He's using the fact that he controls e5 much better than black controls e4 in an otherwise symmetrical position. So white doesn't really have much of an objective advantage here. His position's quite easy to play, and he can definitely generate some initiative with f4, queen f3 to h3, moves like that. But I think there's ways for black to deal with this. For example, knight d7, bishop b2, bishop b4 check, and or maybe even knight e4 first, and sort of play like a Stonewall setup where white maybe hasn't played the best moves, and I think he's fine. Also, there's a move c5 here, which I think is very interesting. With the white pawn still on b2, the position's a little bit better for white, but with the pawn on b3, it's a very different story because white doesn't have as much of an option of taking d5 here, because after knight d5, e4 is impossible. Normally this would be very strong for white, but here we realize that there's a definite concession made by b3, and that's that the c3 knight is unprotected, so at this point black would win a pawn. If the pawn were still on b2, white could play f3 or something to protect e4. So that would be not so great, and otherwise you're likely to get sort of a hanging pawns position. And these positions are pretty typical for the line, except normally black is already committed to putting his knight on d7, and in this case the knight will come to c6. And I think the position's quite acceptable for both sides, but I think black has reasonable play. I played this recently for black myself. So that's sort of the one thing to mention there. Sorry, after knight f6, e3, black does have other options. Like a6 doesn't make nearly as much sense here as it does after knight c3. because one of the main points of playing b5 was that the knight on c3 gets dominated then and potentially poked. But here, because white hasn't developed the knight there yet, we'll probably get sort of a similar setup. Let's say we just make normal-looking moves to the one we just saw, except black has played a6 and b5, which seems to not do anything because white's playing the same moves anyway, and black can't really relieve the tension on the queen side. And indeed, after knight d2, with knight e5 and f4 coming next, white should be better. But so this is a good weapon against the a6 Slav, but bishop f5 and bishop g4 are both playable moves, and oftentimes black gives up the bishop pair. Let's say bishop f5, knight c3, e6, knight h4, bishop g6, takes. Black gives up the bishop pair, but his position is very solid, and in the meantime, white's bishop on c1 isn't the most active piece. So there's a pretty healthy idea behind this plan for black. I think it's pretty acceptable. So bishop g4 is pretty similar. It's very likely the bishop has to trade for the knight at some point. Knight c3, e6, h3. And again, black's very solid, and his logic is that the bishop on c1 is not so active, so the bishop pair shouldn't help white that much. Again, that's a very interesting position. So I think that will be it for this lecture on the Slav. So on this lecture, this part of the Queen's Gambit series, and this will finish off the part of the Slav. I'm going to start by looking at d4, d5, c4, e6.